Socrates was much more than a footballer. He once said, "I smoke, I drink, and I think," which is not something you expect to hear from a footballer. With nearly 300 goals as a midfielder and probably about as many assists, that made him one of the best of all time, but none of it compares to the man himself. He was larger than life, a defiant and captivating leader, and I don't mean just on the pitch, but definitely off of it as well. His voice inspired millions to fight for their rights, and he managed to use football as a tool to get closer to his people. He lived an exceptional life, one so worthy of remembrance. Everyone should know about it. So today, I'll try my best to bring that story to you. Enjoy. The year was 1954 and a boy was born with a rather strange name, Socrates. Like the philosopher, it had been his father's decision. He was a public servant and intellectual who believed in the system, but soon its flaws would start showing and the sparkle in his eyes would fade into the darkness that ensued. Young Socrates was nothing like the other Brazilian talents. He grew up with access to the finest of education and motivated by his father, he grew in love with their own library. It left him in awe that soon turned to terror as one day he opened the door only to find his dad standing over a pile of books, burning them one at a time. This moment stayed with him forever. His dad had just received news that Brazil was now under military dictatorship. Censorship was to become ever present, and the knowledge in those books had become a danger to the family. At his school, Socrates had shown great promise in football. Despite being far taller than most, no one would mistake that for clumsiness. He was clearly blessed with one of the most graceful touches football had ever seen. His overall play matched his lifestyle. Socrates had a clear disdain for any sort of work, and in the same way he would manage to make it to med school without ever studying for an exam. On the pitch, where power and pace was key for others, his mind would far outweigh any contribution his body could make. At 16 he joined his local club Botafogo, not the one that employed Garrincha, just another one smaller but with the same name. From here on out he lived a double life. His main focus was to become a doctor, but every time he entered the pitch, his talent was too evident to be overlooked. He would take football as a hobby, but still by the time he turned 22 he was already topping goal-scoring charts despite playing in midfield, barely training, and being up against some of the best players in the country. He was a savant, a prodigy wherever he went. In 1997, a new coach tried to tell him, a player who doesn't train can't come to the game. But after watching him play, no matter if Socrates came to the locker room smelling of booze and cigarettes, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he had to be allowed to play regardless. And after one outstanding performance after the other, everyone was looking for his signing. He still insisted that he'd rather focus on becoming a doctor, but Corinthians nearly bribed him with an absurd contract and he ended up taking on the beautiful game instead. On his first season there, he would face some criticism as the fans expected the Brazilian midfielder to be more physical. But in the end, the fans would be more than pleased to embrace his playstyle, especially given how decisive he could be, going forward and often saving the team whenever they faced a deadlock. So much so that he would score in the final of the Paulista Regional Championship to take home his first trophy and earn his first call-up to the national team. After an exceptional display with 2 goals in a friendly against Uruguay, it was decided that Socrates was now a fundamental piece for Brazil's assault at the Copa America, joining one of the most talented squads of all time with players like the legendary Zico and Falcao. And indeed they almost made it, with Socrates scoring twice against Argentina to secure their place in the knockout stage and then scoring against Paraguay to no avail as Brazil would lose out on minimal margin. The following season, Socrates took it all a step further, but something really special took over the spotlight. The Uruguayan Federation had organized a tournament so that all World Cup winning nations would face each other in a showdown to decide who among them was the very best. It was known as the World Champions Gold Cup, or more endearingly, Mundialito. Right in the first match, Socrates' assist clinched the draw as they faced Maradona's Argentina. Then would come Germany, and it would have a boring start with the first goal coming on the 54th minute to put Germany in front. But then, Brazil bounced back with unmatchable force, and in 26 minutes, they scored 4 goals to make it onto the final. where of course they would have to defeat the home nation, Uruguay, who they would fail to beat as perhaps the strongest team of all time was sent home without a trophy once again. When Sócrates came back, he found his club quickly plummeting towards relegation in what was a meltdown of epic proportions that eventually culminated in the president leaving his spot up for the taking. It was at this very moment that Sócrates saw an opportunity. They saw that the flaws found in the structure of their club were the same they found in Brazil's government, which was still under a military dictatorship where any revolutionaries were tortured to death. And so it was decided the club would not have a ruler. Every decision would be taken only after a vote by everyone who worked there. An executive's vote mattered as much as that of the players or the groundsman or even the cleaning lady. They called it the Corinthian democracy. In fact, Sócrates was a dedicated activist, as empathetic as he was intelligent. If on one hand, his intellect led him to be an exceptional playmaker, the sort of player who always stays one step ahead, it also led to his downfall emotionally and psychologically. His country was one without freedom, one where knowledge was hidden from the people, as it was known without it, they'd be much easier to tame. All of this depressed him more and more, but to the contrary of what you might expect, the club psychologist found that it was at his worst moments, when he felt utterly hopeless and angry at his surroundings, that he shined the most on the pitch. It was as if Sócrates played to let go of his own anger, to free himself from the shackles of the world he hadn't chosen for himself. That year, in preparation for the World Cup, he provided us with a moment that truly encompassed his free-spirited, brutally honest nature. The whole squad was out on a bar in Stuttgart. Sócrates stood in the middle, giving a speech with a cigarette on one hand and a beer bottle on the other, charismatic as ever. A reporter walks in, asks for an interview, and he complies. As the camera begins filming, the reporter drags the empty beer bottles off the shot, not to tarnish his image. Sócrates puts them back in place and calmly and assertively tells him, "I drink when I want to drink. I already have a father and I won't be needing another one." Under the people's rule, Corinthians turned the corner and started performing, qualifying onto the Brazilian Championship, where they even managed to go to the semi-finals, only losing to title holders Grêmio. At the regional level, they would even go on to win the whole thing. But before that, it was time for perhaps the biggest moment in the career of Sócrates. Welcome to the 1982 World Cup. According to, well, everyone in the world, Brazil were the clear favorites. They were considered an era-defining squad. Their style was unique and electrifying, and so it needed a name. Once Sócrates was asked what he should call it, he smirked and said, "Organized Chaos." And very chaotic they were indeed. Right on the first match, the Soviet Union went in front and seemed unwilling to let go of their advantage, but then, with 15 minutes to go, Sócrates got the ball about 30 yards away from goal, dribbled one player, then two, then blasted it onto the bar, which would send it into the goal. With a late winner by Éder, Brazil would win the match, and Sócrates would describe his goal as not just a goal, but an endless orgasm. From here on out, they convincingly beat Scotland, New Zealand, and even Maradona's Argentina, but then, needing just a draw against Italy to make it to the final stage, Paolo Rossi set out to make it as hard as possible for them. 5 minutes in, he scored. 7 minutes after that, Sócrates leveled the match after a magnificent combination with the ever-so-magical Zico. Still, by the 25th minute, Rossi had scored yet again. Over the second half, Brazil managed to level it out again, but as amazing as they were also highly emotional and stubborn. They had a reputation to live up to, and they were not about to settle for the draw. That was their biggest mistake, and it was made painfully obvious as Rossi got his hat-trick with yet another goal from a counter-attack to send them out of the tournament. In Brazil, this became known as the day football died. As club football resumed, Sócrates and Corinthians' efforts towards changing the path of their own country's history continued. Signs of protest became louder and larger, and now the government was on the lookout. It all escalated further when the final of the regional championship put Corinthians, the champions of the people, against São Paulo, the club of the state capital, the club of the elites. The banners that day were not about football, neither were the chants, neither was anything else. In the end, Corinthians won 4-1 and the people had a reason to smile. As Socrates scored and stood motionless, fist aimed at the sun, it was hope that they had just been given, hope that they could indeed fight back. It was at this time that Socrates began heavily associating himself with a movement known as Diretas Já, a social unrest movement that demanded the military step down and allowed for elections to take place. Socrates went from town to town giving speeches and putting himself to work for a future he so deeply desired, and about a year later, the same final had to be played once again, and it was like a deja vu. Socrates scored, he put out his fist, Corinthians took the win, and the people smiled once more. The players carried a banner that said, "Win or lose, always in democracy." You have to realize, every big European club would gladly make it rain for Socrates, and he even considered the chance of moving. But this was what truly mattered to him. Through his game he had influenced the path of his country, he had managed to shape a whole revolutionary movement at his image. He had given hope to his people. Nothing was worth more than that. Inflation had taken a hold of the entire country, but the rich sat at a pedestal, unaffected by it all, while the poor were now ravaged by hunger and death. The turnaround had started. Manifesting was now not just something for angsty youths. The people were gathering by the millions, and finally they managed to instill enough fear on those at power that an amendment for voting rights to be given back to the people was put forward. As they gathered to celebrate in São Paulo, Socrates was a center figure in the stage. There were about 1 million people watching. No stadium could have ever given him that feeling. No crowd would ever roar that way for any goal he could ever score. To put extra pressure on Congress to pass the amendment, Socrates addressed rumors that he was leaving to Italy by saying that he would only stay if the amendment was passed. On the day of the voting, the military violently stopped more than 100 congressmen from voting, and it all fell about a couple dozen votes short of coming to fruition. Socrates was devastated, and even if at first it could have all been a bluff, in an act of protest, he left the country, joining Fiorentina. This had everything to go well, but it very much did not. With Zico at Udinese, Falcao at Roma, and Maradona at Napoli, it could have made up for some incredible stories, but all we got was a tale of a complete misfit. The weather, the defensive playstyle, the fashion, every bit of Italian culture seemed to clash with Socrates' free-spirited lifestyle. It has been said that he was so put off by their formal attire that he would cut his teammates' ties with scissors if they dared to enter his house while wearing a suit. With an aristocratic right-wing club owner, Socrates, a man who named his own son Fidel, was more than unwelcomed, and after less than a year he was on a plane back to Brazil. With many eager to give him a job, Flamengo were the lucky ones in the end, rescuing both Socrates and Zico from the other side of the world in one single motion. Once back in Brazil, nothing was like it had been. After a year of loneliness, Copacabana and the rabbit hole that was its nightlife proved too tempting for Socrates, who had never been the strongest when it came to staying on a path of sobriety. When it came to his activism, it all derailed even further. As he arrived, the dictatorship had now been overthrown and he felt useless and without a purpose. If once he had made newspaper covers as a hero, the champion of the people, now he was on them for one drunken embarrassment after the other. Once they got a final shot at the World Cup, Zico had fallen behind, now not even a guaranteed starter, and Socrates had been stripped off his captaincy, no longer seen as a role model, and he would have to adapt to a whole new generation if he was to make history. He even performed well at first, but as they met France, Zico missed a penalty during the match and Socrates himself missed another during the shootout, and Brazil were once more trophyless. They truly were a golden generation doomed to disappoint forever. The most iconic moment of the tournament would come as Socrates, shocked by the devastation caused to Mexico City by an earthquake, walked onto the pitch with a headband reading "México sigue en pie." Over the following months, injuries began consuming him, and by the end of the season, Zico and Socrates had played one single match together, and so, once upon a time, Socrates checked the team sheet to find he was once again among the substitutes, and in his classic, drama-fueled manner, threw his boots into the bin and announced he was retired. But it didn't last long. Once back in college trying to get back into his medical practice, he quickly realized that football meant much more for him than he was giving it credit for. And so when Santos made themselves available, he could not say no to an opportunity to join his childhood club. He played there for about a year and a half before joining his first team Botafogo for a few months and calling it quits once again, but still not for good. His retirement would be one of intense drama. He never seemed satisfied off the pitch and quickly traded his wife for a 20-year-old tennis player, in the second of 4 marriages he'd go on to have. His professional career followed the same pattern. One day he coached, one day he was a doctor, the other an actor, and whenever he got bored, he found himself on a bar stool drinking himself to death. By the time he turned 50 years old, somehow he still managed to make a comeback. Simon Clifford was creating an entire academy structure that aimed at creating a link between Brazilian and English football, and when he became the coach of Garforth Town, in the 8th year of British football, he looked to bring some retired legends on board. He tried signing Zico, Jairzinho, and in the end, the ever so keen to help Socrates said why not, and fulfilled his wish. Went on a tour of all the academies he had set up and made his comeback to football, though he would only put on the Garforth Town shirt once. Socrates lived a full but short life. In 1983 he said, "I want to die on a Sunday, on the day Corinthians become champions." In 2011, cirrhosis finally took his life after years of constant problems with alcohol. And that day, Corinthians played Palmeiras and the goalless draw confirmed it in the end. Corinthians were champions on the day of his death. A Sunday just like he had wished for. So yeah, that was Socrates' career in a video. I hope you enjoyed. He was an amazing person, really interesting. That's it. I'll see you next week. Bye.